Impossible subjects, part 6. Foreign policy also influenced American legal posture toward Asian Indian immigration. In that case, immigration policy turned in large part on American relations with Great Britain and the evolution of Asiatic exclusion within the British Empire. Asian Indians first entered the United States in significant numbers in 1906 through 1909, after a racist movement in British Columbia drove them out of work and wrested an agreement from the British to halt Indian immigration to Canada. In the western United States, Asian Indians met an atmosphere already hostile to Chinese and Japanese people, but their status as British subjects made it possible that they might be protected from racial attacks. The first race riot against Asian Indians in Bellingham, Washington in the summer of 1907, a 3-day-long rampage of 500 white sawmill workers that drove Indian workers out of town, prompted an inquiry from the British ambassador to the United States. But the British had their own reasons for discouraging Indian immigration into the United States. They worried that Indians would find sympathy for Indian self-government among anti-imperialists in the United States. They had already retreated from upholding the rights of their Indian subjects within the British Empire, acquiescing to demands by the White Canada movement, as well as white settlers in Natal, the Transvaal, and Australia to exclude Indians from their corners of the Dominion. Thus, the British ambassador did little more than register a pro forma complaint after the Bellingham riot. The Roosevelt administration considered the status of Asian Indians important only as it affected American relations with Great Britain and Japan. As long as the British turned a blind eye, the administration hoped to use Indian exclusion to pressure Japan for Japanese exclusion. The right to naturalization became the principal grounds upon which Japanese and Indian immigrants fought for their rights in America. As early as the first decade of the century, the Bureau of Naturalization informed clerks of court that they should warn petitioners who appeared to be not white that the courts might deny their application for citizenship. In 1906, Charles Bonaparte, United States Attorney General, specifically held Japanese to be ineligible and instructed clerks of court to refuse Japanese petitions. Asian Indians, as British subjects, may have been eligible to citizenship under an 1870 agreement of reciprocity between the United States and England, but in 1907 Bonaparte stated flatly, under no construction of the law can natives of British India be regarded as white persons. Despite these instructions, during the 1900s and 1910s, several hundred Japanese and South Asian Indians became naturalized citizens. Immigrants who were denied citizenship on grounds of racial ineligibility repaired to the federal courts for redress. Sometimes the United States litigated against immigrants who they believed had been improperly naturalized by the local courts. In each case, the court's decision turned on whether the petitioner could be considered a white person within the meaning of the statute. The possibility that the petitioners might legally be defined as black was never considered, notwithstanding legal and social precedents that treated Asians akin to black people. In the early 20th century, however, no one seeking naturalized citizenship appealed to the courts claiming legal status as a black person, owing to the geographic emphasis of the law's language, persons of African nativity or descent, as well as the social stigma of unequal status associated with blackness. Immigrants who were denied citizenship on account of race took grave offense. Racial ineligibility not only implied a status of innate inferiority, but also contradicted the democratic premise of citizenship in the American nation. During the Progressive Era, assimilative practices emphasized Americanizing immigrants through teaching the English language, the work ethic, the Constitution, and other democratic values. If Europeans could become Americans through education, why could not others? Moreover, in 1918, Congress had granted any alien who served during the First World War the right to naturalize without first making a declaration of intent and without proof of 5 years' residence, suggesting that loyalty, especially in its ultimate test, qualified one to citizenship. The lower courts naturalized some Japanese, Asian, Indians, and Filipinos on that basis. Take Ozawa argued his case for citizenship on the grounds of his impeccable moral character, his assimilation to American society, and his wholehearted embrace of the American political ideals. He had immigrated from Japan as a child in 1894, graduated from high school in Berkeley, California, and attended the University of California. He moved to Honolulu in 1906, married, and had 2 children whom he sent to American church and school. He worked for an American company, spoke English fluently, and did not drink, smoke, or play cards. In name, General Benedict Arnold was an American, but at heart he was a traitor. In name, I am not an American, but at heart I am a true American, said Ozawa in his brief to the court. Bhagat Singh Thind similarly argued that he was willing and eager to undertake the responsibilities of citizenship, having shown my eagerness by buying Liberty bonds to help carry on America's part in the war and by enlisting in the fighting forces of the country. Thind wrote his brief from Camp Lewis, Washington, where he was stationed with the United States Army. He was a veteran of the World War who had come to the United States from Punjab in 1913. He was a Democrat who supported Indian self-rule. In federal court, District Judge Charles Wolverton upheld Thind's naturalization, citing witnesses who were most favorably impressed with his deportment and manifestly believed in his attachment to the principles of this government. Ozawa and Thind thus argued their claims on the principle of consensual citizenship, but that principle was always a double-edged sword, for the idea of a social compact required consent by both the individual and the community. It implied liberal, inclusive possibilities, but it also justified racism and exclusion. The exclusionary side of consent was articulated most forcefully in the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision. The ideological foundation of Chief Justice Taney's infamous statement that Negroes had no rights that white people were bound to respect lay in the idea that the former were not party to the social contract embodied in the Constitution. Similarly, in the mid-19th century, American nationalism revived the mythology of Anglo-Saxonism, ascribing a racial origin to, and thus exclusive ownership of, the democratic foundations of the nation. The racial tensions within the basic doctrine of citizenship complicated the matter of immigrants' rights to naturalize. Since the principle of consensual citizenship was not absolute, the courts felt no compulsion to rule on the propriety of race as a condition of citizenship. Indeed, despite the 14th Amendment, whiteness was already a condition of full citizenship. But by the turn of the century, African Americans had been forced into second-class status by disenfranchisement, lynching, and Jim Crow segregation. Kelly Miller, a professor at Howard University, wrote in The Nation in 1924 that the racial requirement to citizenship was the most curious inconsistency to be found in American law. The race most deeply despised is a yoke fellow in privilege when it comes to citizenship eligibility. Notwithstanding, of course, that in apportioning the privileges and advantages of citizenship, the Negro is set apart in a separate class by state laws. Miller advocated for eliminating all racial distinctions from the law. Nativists and exclusionists drew the opposite conclusion. They commonly held that the low social status of the Negro was proof that granting citizenship to the freed slaves had been a mistake. The same mistake should not be repeated by granting citizenship to Asiatics. Thus, the racial prerequisite cases would not decide on which side of America's Herrenvolk democracy Asians and other non-Europeans would fall. Ozawa, Thind, and other immigrants seeking naturalizations did not challenge the constitutionality of the racial prerequisite. They made their claims on grounds of their adherence to American ideas, but they also argued that within the terms of the law they were white and therefore also racially eligible to citizenship. Their arguments were thus contradictory, reflecting both democratic sentiments and strategic decisions to argue according to the law and not against its discriminatory nature. Ironically, the few petitioners who successfully litigated their status as white persons did so with the aid of scientific race theories. In 1909, a federal court in Georgia ruled that George Najur, a Syrian, was eligible to citizenship. District Judge Newman stated that that free white person referred to race, not color. Fair or dark complexions should not be able to control race, he said. Judge Newman cited A.H. Keene's The World's People, which divided the world's people into 4 categories: the Negro, or black, in the Sudan, South Africa, and the oceans; Mongol, or yellow, in Central, North, and East Asia; Amarans, red or brown, in the New World; and Caucasians, white and also dark, in North Africa, Europe, Irania, India, Western Asia, and Polynesia, and noted that Keene unhesitatingly placed the Syrians in the Caucasian or white division. Using similar logic, federal courts admitted Syrians, Armenians, and Asian Indians to citizenship as white people in 7 cases between 1909 and 1923. In each case, the court interpreted whiteness to mean something more than just color and bowed to anthropologic and ethnologic definitions of race. Not all the courts agreed. Most ruled against the petitioner's claim to whiteness, usually relying on common knowledge definitions of race. During the 1910s, white and Caucasian became increasingly antagonistic concepts in judicial argument. Takao Ozawa cited anthropology and ethnology that identified Japanese as Caucasian or white. Although the Japanese had mixed with the Mongolian and Malay races, their dominant strains are white persons speaking an Aryan tongue and having Caucasian rootstock. That was why Ozawa said the uncovered part of the Japanese body is white, and moreover why Japanese possess a mental alertness, a quality of mind in which they differ from other Asiatics and resemble the Europeans and the inhabitants of North America above the Mexican line. Racially, Japanese are a superior class fit for citizenship. Moreover, Ozawa argued, Japanese were quite assimilable. The rest of Asia was hopelessly backward, but Japan had imbibed Western values and made the transition to modernity. The Japanese race was highly adaptable, having absorbed centuries ago elements of ancient Chinese culture when it was great, and more recently the modern ways introduced after Commodore Matthew Perry opened Japan to the West. Ozawa understood the profound irony of his historical predicament. It is preposterous to claim that a nation which has shown itself to have the greatest capacity for adaptation, against whom the severest criticism is that they are imitators, is not capable of adjusting itself to our civilization, he said. Once establishing his racial pedigree, however, Ozawa betrayed a democratic impulse, saying that the race should not determine citizenship. The preservation of a conventional racial type is a matter of aesthetics, he said. What really counts in humanity is home influence and education, and where the ideals are high, racial type is of little moment. The Supreme Court grappled with the inconsistencies in racial taxonomies. It acknowledged that color as an indicator of race was insufficient, given the overlapping races as a gradual merging of one into the other, without any practical line of separation. Despite the impossibility of determining clear racial types, the court resisted the logical conclusion that no scientific grounds for race existed. The court sidestepped the problem by simply asserting that white and Caucasian were one and the same, since an almost unbroken line of decision in federal and state courts held that white persons meant to indicate only a person of what is popularly known as the Caucasian race. The court said Japanese cannot be Caucasian because they are not white. In Ozawa, one senses the court struggling to reconcile race as a popular concept. As scientific classification and as judicial and congressional precedent, the court tried to invoke science to its advantage, but foundered when confronted with scientific theories of race. Ozawa eluded the differences between common understanding and scientific evidence, as in its phrase popularly known as Caucasian. Thus, Ozawa settled the issue of Japanese ineligibility of citizenship, but it did not clearly resolve the problem of racial definition. In Ozawa, the court made the prescient comment that the racial prerequisite to citizenship was part of our history. 3 months later, when the Supreme Court ruled on Bhagat Singh Thine's petition for citizenship, the court found its grounding in history. Thine argued his eligibility to citizenship as a white person based on his Aryan and Caucasian roots. Speaking literally, color cannot be the only test of the white or Caucasian race. Strictly speaking, no one is white. The true test of race is blood or descent, he said, citing anthropological experts at length. Thine noted the Aryans of India have physical features about the same as the modern Englishman or German. They are tall, long-headed race with distinct European features, and their color on the average is not as dark as the Portuguese or Spanish, and is lighter than the Moor, because marrying outside of caste in India is strictly forbidden. Thine argued that he was a pure Aryan. The government conceded that Thine might be a borderline case, ethnologically speaking, but averted that the meaning of the statute was clear that Hindus are excluded from white persons. It rejected Thine's claim to whiteness as ridiculous. In the popular conception, he is alien to the white race and part of the white man's burden. Whatever may be the white man's burden, the Hindu does not share it, rather he imposes it. The court clarified the meaning of Ozawa, saying, Caucasian is a conventional word of much flexibility. The word Caucasian by common uses has acquired a popular meaning, not clearly defined to be sure, but sufficiently so to enable us to say that it's popular as distinguished from its scientific application is of appreciably narrower scope. The words of the statute are to be interpreted in accordance with the common man from whose vocabulary they were taken. What mattered, said the court, was the racial designation of living persons now possessing in common the requisite characteristics, not in the dim reaches of antiquity. In Thine, the court dismissed science altogether. The term Caucasian, it said, under scientific manipulation has come to include far more than the unscientific mind suspects, noting Keene's classification of not only Indians but also Polynesians and the Hamites of Africa as Caucasians. The court commented dryly, we venture to think that the average well-informed white American would learn with some degree of astonishment that the race to which he belongs is made up of such heterogeneous elements. Moreover, scientific authorities disagreed irreconcilably over the proper racial division. Blumenbach has 5 races, Keene 4, Denneker 29, and in any case, the original framers of the law used familiar words of speech, intending to include only the type of man whom they knew as white. Those from the British Isles and northwestern Europe, bone of their bone, flesh of their flesh, and their kind whom they must have had affirmatively in mind.